chilly December afternoon, hundreds of people were sitting in the packed-out Iroquois Theatre, mesmerised by the comedic production called Mr Bluebeard. Now, what they didn't know was that this theatre that was touted as being absolutely fireproof was actually a death trap. It would soon turn into a blazing inferno, an oven that would snuff out over 600 lives, most of them women and children. This would be one of the deadliest theatre fires ever in history. It sent shockwaves throughout the entire industry, resulting in many of the safety features that we see in theatres around the globe today. This is the truly heartbreaking story of the Iroquois Theatre fire. Our story takes us to Chicago, Illinois. The year is 1903. In just 5 months, the jewel of Chicago had been constructed, the Iroquois Theatre. So quick was its construction that people joked that it must have been whisked into existence using Aladdin's lamp. Located on the busy Randolph Street, it stood out like a sparkling diamond. It was opulent, awe-inspiring, and its beauty was just overwhelming. No expense had been spared in its creation. Well, where it mattered, at least, and making it as beautiful as could be.
So, let me guess, they skimped on the safety features. I'm definitely noticing a pattern with these stories.
Well, yes, but who needs safety features when you've got ornate chandeliers and gorgeous velvet drapery? There was a shortage of workers due to strike action, and corners just had to be cut so they could open in time for the festive period. Now, the theatre was actually hailed as being absolutely fireproof, mostly because it had 30 exits, so it could be emptied of people in just 5 minutes. The architect even boasted that he'd studied every theatre disaster in history to make sure that his designs were safe. The Iroquois opened on the 23rd of November with the play Mr Bluebeard, a musical comedy that would be presented in 3 acts. It was to be a spectacular affair, with special effects beyond imagination, a cast and crew of around 400, elaborate stage sets and fabulous costuming. It would even star Eddie Foy, one of the leading comedians of the time. Interestingly, despite the grandeur of the show, it received mixed reviews and ticket sales were really quite lacklustre. The slump wouldn't last for long though. The matinee performance on the 30th of December would prove to be incredibly popular. You see, school was out for Christmas and lots of parents thought a family trip to the Iroquois would be a fabulous New Year's treat. Children up and down the country were filled with excitement, eagerly awaiting what for many would be their first trip to the theatre. Wednesday the 30th of December finally arrived. It was a bitterly cold day, with flecks of snow swirling in the air. Dorcia Hayes and her brother awoke early, unable to contain their excitement. Seeing Mr Bluebeard was all the 2 children could talk about. They were going to have a fabulous family day out. First, they would visit all the fancy department stores, followed by a tasty lunch, and then the thrilling main event. Ruthie Thompson, 8, and her brother John, 9, had never been to the theatre before, and they too were bursting with excitement. They would attend the show with their mother, their aunts, and also their grandpa. Eddie Foy was hoping that his family could come along and see him perform that afternoon. But alas, there were no tickets available. He decided that he'd still bring along his 6-year-old son Brian. He was sure that he could find him a seat somewhere. The 2 p.m. curtain time was fast approaching, and the theatre was now heaving, filled with a cheerful, very well-dressed crowd. But Dorcia and her family were not there. As Dorcia's family made the very long trip from Galesburg to Chicago, a heavy feeling, a feeling of dread, washed over Dorcia's mother. Something was telling her not to go to the theatre. She broke the news to the rest of her family over lunch. "But we're not going," she said. "We can't, we mustn't, not this time." Dorcia and her brother were crushed. They promised that they'd be well behaved, but this wasn't the issue. Their mother just couldn't shake this feeling of dread, this feeling of alarm. Back at the theatre, Eddie tried to find a seat for his son. He'd never seen it this full before, especially with so many women and children. Every single seat was taken. He ended up putting his son on a stool in the wings. The Iroquois had a seating capacity of around 1,600, but that afternoon, some estimate that the theatre was 500 over capacity. One woman looked around her, noticing that the place was absolutely bursting at the seams, with people even sitting in the aisles. She blurted out, "Oh, what a death trap!" The show would begin soon, and so ushers started barring the stairways leading from the balconies, so the dress circle and the galleries. They did this with accordion gates, basically locking these theatregoers in, and they did this to stop them from trying to sneak down onto the more expensive seats on the main floor.
Wait, they locked them in? That lady really hit the nail on the head. What a death trap.
Indeed, especially as it meant that many of the exits were now out of reach for them. The curtain rose and the first act passed without a hitch, the children in awe of all the lights, colours and sounds. During the second act, though, something would go dreadfully wrong. The house lights dimmed and a spotlight turned on, bathing the stage in a cool blue glow. It was time for the romantic number, called The Pale Moonlight. The spotlight began to crackle and splutter, and then it happened. A small orange flame leapt from the light. The spotlight operator frantically tried to put the fire out, slapping at it with his bare hands, but it was spreading too quickly. Before long, the flames had reached the curtains above. He shouted to a man on the catwalk to put it out. "Damn it, I am, cried the man, slapping at the burning curtains. The fire spread even further. It was ravenous, and the velvet drapes and the muslin curtains were a veritable feast. It wasn't long before clouds of black smoke began to rise. The actors on stage realised that something wasn't right. They could see the flames and the smoke, but as always, the show must go on, so they continued to sing and to dance. Someone would manage to put the flames out soon, they were sure of it.
Well, I mean, the theatre's absolutely fireproof, right? Right? They must have some pretty serious fire defences up their sleeves?
Well, you think so, but it would turn out that the theatre's only defence against fire were a mere 6 tubes of kill fire and a supposedly asbestos fire curtain. Now, kill fire was wholly inadequate for the task. It was a powder that was made to put out residential fires. There were no sprinklers, no fire buckets, and the standpipes, well, they hadn't been connected yet. The house fireman, William Sellers, frantically flung the kill fire at the flames, but the flames were just out of reach. He ripped open tube after tube, but it wasn't helping. The fire was climbing higher and higher, spreading to the highly flammable scenery in the rafters. William yelled for the theatre's fire curtain to be dropped. Unfortunately, the curtain man had taken ill that day, and Joe, who was standing in for him, couldn't for the life of him remember which rope or which switch controlled which curtain. The performers remained composed for as long as possible, but when burning pieces of fabric began to rain down around them, they could hide their terror no longer. They stiffened, their voices faltered, and they couldn't keep their dancing in time with the music. The audience began to notice that something was wrong too. They followed the performer's gaze. They were now looking up. And then they saw it, the orange-red glow of the flickering flames. Some realised the danger and started to panic, but were told to shh, keep quiet in case they started to stampede. Many children thought that it was some kind of special effect, and so they sat silently, captivated by the dancing glow. Many of the dancers backstage were blissfully unaware of the impending danger. A group of them were laughing and chatting in their dressing room, high up on the 5th floor, when they suddenly heard cries of "Fire! Fire!" Their chatter silenced, and they hurriedly tried to make their way out of the building. As they flew out of the dressing room, one of the dancers, Violet Sidney, buckled and twisted her ankle. She cried out in agony, but the other dancers, wrapped up in fear and panic, made a run for it, leaving poor Violet behind. That is, all except Lola Quinlan. Lola bravely stayed by her friend's side, supporting Violet by the waist. She helped her down many, many flights of stairs, all the way across the burning stage and outside to safety. Lola sustained terrible burns in the process, but she had heroically saved her friend's life. Robert Smith operated the elevator that carried the cast and crew from the upper dressing rooms down to the stage. Robert proved himself to be a true hero that afternoon. He could have fled amidst the chaos, but he didn't. He stayed, making trip after trip to the various dressing rooms, fighting through the thick smoke and bundling dancers into the elevator so that they could be taken to safety. On his final trip, the elevator filled with terrified cast members. He noticed that the control panel had become engulfed with flames. He had no choice. He braced himself and then plunged his hand into the flames to bring the elevator back down. Stagehands then helped to guide the performers outside. The heat and the smoke and the fumes were becoming too much to bear for Robert. He was beginning to lose consciousness. But then he felt a strong pair of hands grip him tightly, and they whisked him away to safety. Cries of "Sound the alarm! Pull the box!" could be heard. A stagehand rushed to find the alarm, but there was none to be found. There wasn't even a telephone. In the end, this stagehand had to escape the burning theatre and run as fast as his legs could carry him all the way to the fire station number 13 to alert them personally. Eddie Foy was backstage changing into one of his many costumes when he heard people shouting. He rushed out of his dressing room to see what was going on and saw that the curtains were on fire. His first thought was, of course, for his son Brian's safety. Eddie's eyes darted around the theatre until they found him. He rushed over to Brian, scooped him up, and asked the stagehand to quickly take him out into the alley. Knowing that his son would be safe, his mind now turned to the panicked crowd. Someone needed to calm them down. Heroically, he ran back to the stage and addressed the audience. "Keep very quiet, it's all right. Don't get excited and don't stampede." He then called for the fire curtain to be dropped, but the stand-in curtain operator was still struggling. Eddie's heroics, well, they weren't over yet. He asked the remaining musicians, many had already fled outside, to play something, anything, an overture, in the hopes that this would help to keep people calm. "Go out slowly," he shouted. "Leave slowly," he said, as burning bits of scenery descended from above. The other actors had begun to flee the stage, and some had passed out from the fumes. The stagehands worked to carry them to safety. For the most part, Eddie's words fell on deaf ears. Some listened to his appeal for calm, but quite understandably, much of the crowd was already whipped into a frenzy. They were clambering over the plush velvet seats and each other. It was every man for himself. Children were ripped from their mothers and thrown to the floor. Screams of terror pierced the air. There were cries of "Please don't trample me," but the crush of people was just too immense. Scarves, gloves, purses and hats were flung left, right and centre. People rushed to any exit they could find, running blindly through the thick smoke. There was no emergency lighting and the exits were not clearly marked. Some found safety and freedom, but others were met with locked doors that wouldn't budge no matter how much they pushed or banged against them. Now, even if the door wasn't locked, there was no guarantee of escape. Some of the doors opened inwards, and it was impossible to open them against the crush of people. Some couldn't even reach an exit because, remember, many of the stairways had been barred with those accordion gates. Those that managed to reach the main staircase were greeted with the human traffic jam. There was one grand stairway that led from the balconies down to the foyer, and nobody could pass in either direction due to the hordes and hordes of people. It was pure chaos. There'd been no fire drills, and the theatre's design was working against escape. An 11-year-old girl called Winnie had been separated from her mother. She looked around her and she could see that the aisles were swarming with people. She'd be crushed if she tried to get out that way. She then had a brilliant idea. She stood on top of one of the seats and then jumped to the next one, and then the next one. She used them as stepping stones to reach an exit, where she escaped to safety. Ruthie Thompson gripped her aunt's hand tightly. She could see that the flames had now reached the ceiling. She said that they were like waterfalls, and they came faster than people could move along in the crowd. Ruthie felt herself lifted off the ground as the sea of adults desperately tried to make their escape. After being pushed around by the seething mass of people for what seemed like an eternity, she was nearly at an exit, nearly to safety, when she found herself hurled back deep into the theatre by the crowd. Now, this little girl was a tough cookie though, and she was determined not to give up. She fought her way to the stage that was now covered in flame and managed to make an escape through the rear exit. Her brother John made a miraculous escape too. A kind man lifted John up over his head, and a chain of adults passed him from person to person over the crowd until he reached an exit. Finally, someone had worked out how to drop the fire curtain. It descended with a maddening slowness before stopping abruptly. One side had lodged itself on a light reflector. Stagehands jumped at the curtain trying to free it, but it was no use. Performers began fleeing for their lives out of an exit in the back of the theatre. Little did they know that this would doom the audience left inside. The skylights above the stage that were meant to provide ventilation, they hadn't been finished yet. They were sealed shut, and this helped to create the perfect conditions for a backdraft effect. When the performers opened that exit, a gust of cold air rushed inside, feeding the fire and creating a devastating fireball. One of the scene shifters described it as a great sheet of circular flame going out under the curtain and into the audience. It roared past Eddie, narrowly missing him, and up towards the balconies. As the audience in the balcony saw the fireball hurtling towards them, they clamoured for the exits, but for many it was no use. The flames tore through the upper levels of the theatre, killing anyone in their wake. Those that made it to the exits found that the fire escapes hadn't been completed yet. There was no ladder or stairs down to the ground. With the fire raging behind them, some decided to jump, but the fall would prove deadly. As the bodies began to pile in the alleyway, they acted as cushioning, saving the lives of others that decided to make the same fateful leap. The alley would come to be known as Death Alley. 16-year-old Hortense and her 11-year-old sister reached the fire escape, horrified to find that there was no way down. Hortense considered jumping, but then a miracle. Some painters that were carrying out work in a university across the alley saw the dreadful scene that was unfolding, and they created a makeshift bridge out of some planks. Hortense took a deep breath and then shuffled across the planks, her little sister in tow. The two made it into the other building. They made it to safety. The painters managed to save many, many lives in this way before the planks could take no more. Within minutes, the Iroquois had transformed into a blazing inferno. It was a scene of utter devastation. Charred bodies were piled 10 feet deep by the exits and in the aisles. People were trampled to death, crushed to death. People died in their seats, overcome by the toxic fumes. By the time the firefighters of engine number 13 arrived, it was too late. Hundreds of people had lost their lives. The firefighters struggled to get the theatre doors open. There were piles and piles of bodies stacked against them. It only took 10 minutes to quell the remaining blaze, because the fire had already devoured everything that would burn, including the so-called fire curtain. It would turn out that the asbestos curtain was actually mostly made out of wood pulp. Inside the theatre, the silence was deafening. "Is there any living person in here?" the firefighters shouted. Silence. But then there was a groan and a moan. A few had miraculously survived, trapped under human shields. The firefighters worked tirelessly to untangle the bodies and free the survivors. For hours and hours on end, firefighters, police officers, reporters and volunteers would remove bodies from the theatre. Fighting back tears, it was a horrific ordeal, truly heartbreaking to see so many little lives lost. Friends and relatives gathered anxiously outside, waiting for news on their loved ones. The nearby community really pulled together to help. Shops, restaurants and hotels threw open their doors to the victims, acting as makeshift treatment centres and temporary morgues. In the department stores, the disaster was all anyone could talk about, and the devastating news quickly spread to Dorsha and her family. That premonition, their mother's gut instinct, had saved them. In total, the fire had claimed 602 lives. Most of the cast and the crew had made it out alive. After the fire, there was huge public outcry. Who was to blame for this awful tragedy? There was a lot of finger-pointing. Who was at fault? Was it the mayor, the building commissioner, the theatre owners, or maybe the house firemen? The blame list went on, but in the end, no one was ever held accountable for the disaster. There were allegations of corruption and bribery. Apparently, free tickets were given to inspectors so that they would look the other way if they saw any issues, but nothing ever came of these allegations either. The fire prompted sweeping reforms in building regulations and fire codes. Changes to theatres included using fireproof materials for scenery, having illuminated exit signs, and having doors that open in the direction of egress. It also led to much wider adoption of the panic bar, a safety feature seen on doors all across the globe today. As for the Iroquois, well, the theatre actually still stands, now as the James M. Nederlander Theatre. It's absolutely awful that so many people died in the Iroquois fire tragedy, but some solace can be taken in the fact that public buildings are much safer today because of it. If you got something from this video, Gargi and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe, listen to your instincts, they could save your life, and I hope you have a magnificent day.